Until then, they'd only ever played 1-hour sets, but now they were expected to play for 7 or 8 hours, so they spun out each song for 20 minutes, cavorting on the tiny stage as they played and stomping their feet to emphasize the beat. John, a natural showman, was brilliant at dancing, rolling around or leaping in the air, and the audience was soon enjoying the cocky young group from Liverpool. The boys were put up in a cinema called the Bambi, which had once been a theatre. The dirty, disused dressing rooms were their living quarters. They slept on camp beds with ancient blankets and used the grubby public toilets with only wash basins, no showers or baths. After playing late into the night, they'd be woken each day by the sound of the first film screening. They'd head for the ladies' toilets, which were the cleanest, but would usually be thrown out by an outraged woman. After 2 months, the Indra was closed because of complaints about the noise, and the Beatles were moved to the Kaiserkeller, where another Liverpool group, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, were playing. The Beatles and Rory Storm's group played alternately through the evening, an hour at a time for 12 hours, and the crowds loved them. The boys knew Rory Storm's group. They were bigger in Liverpool than the Beatles, who had only got the Hamburg job because Rory Storm was busy and turned it down. Later, Rory's band decided to give Hamburg a go, and it was in Hamburg that the boys met the group's drummer, Ringo Starr. He seemed pleasant enough, but they didn't get to know him well. It didn't occur to me that the boys would take drugs. It was only after they got back that John told me they'd learned to stay awake through the night by swallowing slimming pills. Pete had refused to try them, but the others thought they were great and soon graduated to stronger pills, amphetamines, called Black Bombers and Purple Hearts. They barely slept and they didn't eat properly, but they were having the time of their lives, and their contracts were extended several times. I was glad of their success, but all my energies were concentrated on willing John to avoid the temptation of other girls. I began to get worried when he started to write about a girl called Astrid Kircher. She was a photographer's assistant who had seen the Beatles with her boyfriend Klaus Voormann. She had been reluctant to go, but Klaus had wandered into the club alone one night when they were playing and told her that they were sensational. Once Astrid had seen them in action, she agreed with Klaus, and they went back almost every night. Astrid was a middle-class girl who had come across the Beatles in an area where most respectable Hamburg citizens would never go. But once she and Klaus had told their friends about the group, more and more of them went to the club. Gradually, students took over from the previous, somewhat rougher clientele. Astrid was fascinated by the boys' teddy boy style, and they were flattered by her interest. She wanted to photograph them and invited them to her home for tea. They were astonished by her black and white candlelit room and delighted by the ham sarnies she served, the most normal food they'd had in Germany. They began to go most days to Astrid's for a meal. To John and the other boys, Astrid was glamorous and sophisticated. They were bowled over by her hip black clothes, her avant-garde way of life, her photography, and her sense of style. As John's letters became filled with Astrid this and Astrid that, I was consumed with jealousy, certain it would be only a matter of time before he wrote to tell me he was in love with her. Eventually I was put out of my misery. John wrote that Astrid had fallen in love with Stuart. She'd been drawn to his James Dean looks, which were enhanced by the dark glasses he wore almost all the time. Like John and me, he was short-sighted and got around the problem by wearing hip frames with dark prescription lenses. Just as they were about to move to a better club called the Top 10, the police found out, or were tipped off, that George was only 17 and had no work permit or residence permit. The clubs they were playing in didn't admit under 18s. George had got away with it for 4 months, but his luck had run out, and he was ordered to leave the country. Astrid and Stu drove him to the station and put him on a train home with a bag of sweets and some apples. Days later, the other 4 had hit trouble. When Paul and Pete were clearing their things out of the Bambi to move into nicer accommodation at the Top 10, they accidentally started a small fire when a candle fell onto some old sacking. There was little damage, but Koshmina called the police and they were ordered to leave the country. A couple of days later, John was told that his work permit was being revoked, so he too set off for home. He told me later that he'd been terrified travelling alone, wondering if he'd ever find England. He had never been abroad before, and had been driven to Hamburg by Alan Williams, so it was his first journey alone. No wonder as he rattled along in trains for a couple of days he got nervous. Stu was ordered to leave as well, but as he had tonsillitis, Astrid gave him the airfare. As soon as John got back, he called me and I rushed over to his place. He was delighted to see me, but the way things had ended in Germany had left him dispirited. After all their success, they drifted back to England, one or two at a time, with no prospects and no idea of what to do next. As far as he knew, it might be the end of the road for the Beatles. But while the boys had been away, Alan Williams had been busy. He'd sent so many groups to Hamburg that he had decided to build a new club in Liverpool, where they could really show off their talents. He called it the Top 10 after the Hamburg one, but sadly it was burnt down 6 days after it opened. John and the others never even saw it. Their first date, a few weeks after their return, was at the Casbah, where Pete's mum was more than happy to offer them the chance to perform again. Neil Aspinall, who was now living with Mona Best, put posters up all over the place saying, "Return of the Fabulous Beatles," and their loyal audience was delighted to see them again. When I watched them that night, I couldn't believe how much they'd changed since I'd last heard them play. After so many hours of performing in Germany, they'd improved beyond all recognition. They'd gone from good to fantastic, and the fans screamed with delight at the raw, noisy rock and roll the boys played. It was magnetic. You couldn't listen to them without wanting to dance. The Cavern Club had been a traditional jazz venue for some years, but now that jazz was on the wane and rock and roll was taking over, the management had decided they'd better move with the times. The Cavern was in Matthew Street, a cobbled alley full of warehouses, lorries and litter. It was a dark, cramped cellar in a basement with poor ventilation and bad acoustics. The Beatles got a job there through a local disc jockey called Bob Wooler, who was in his late 20s and very involved in the local beat scene. He thought the boys were good and persuaded the Cavern's owner, Ray McFall, to give them a try. Bob first announced the Beatles at the Cavern on March the 21st, 1961, and before long they were playing there several times a week, at lunchtimes and in the evenings. Over the next couple of years they played there 292 times altogether. Within weeks of the boys starting to play regularly at the Cavern, girls all over Liverpool were slipping out of school at lunchtime and coming to the club, where they'd queue down the street to get in. The most ardent of these was a group John called the Beatlettes, who hung round the stage, fetching the boys drinks and shouting song requests. The Beatles were kind to these regular fans, and knowing they had little money, sometimes bought them a cup of tea or gave them a free ticket. I went to all the gigs with the group, and as John's girlfriend, I was often singled out by jealous fans. I learned to stick like glue to my friend Pauline, the girlfriend, later wife, of Jerry Marsden. His group, Jerry and the Pacemakers, were often on the same bill as the Beatles. Jerry was an ex-van driver who became good friends with John. They matched each other for wit and humour. Pauline and I were fine while the boys were playing, because the attention was on them. But in the breaks we'd always make sure that we went to the ladies together, because that was where trouble usually flared up. We learned to keep our heads down and not to look any girl in the eye, dashing in and out without bothering to redo our lippy. Even so, we'd often get, "She's a slag, what does he see in her?" spat at us as we passed. But as well as the jealous fans, there were the nice ones who would say, "If John loves her then, we do as well, give her a break." They'd look out for us and hold back the angry ones if they threatened to leap on us and tear our hair out. The boys loved having such a devoted following in Liverpool. It had taken John and Paul 5 years, but at last they'd found success in their hometown. Despite that, though, they were still keen to give Hamburg another try. It had been one of the most exciting times in their lives, but because they'd been ordered to leave, they couldn't be sure they'd be allowed back in. However, other bands were still going there, and they didn't want to be left out. Alan Williams came to their rescue. He wrote to the German consulate, praising the boys' musical ability and characters, and explained that they'd been exploited on their previous visit. This time, he said, they were going to work for an honourable businessman, Peter Eckhorn, owner of the Top 10 Club. It did the trick. The boys were given work permits, and George was now 18, so there was no problem with his age. In April 1961, they set off for Hamburg for their second visit. This time, I was quite happy about it, because I was going too.